Project Lawful aka Planecrash by Arwayne aka Eliezer Yudkowsky and Lintamande. To Hell with Science, Episode 131.
Pilar raises her hand before anyone else. She's faster than even Asmodia once she knows exactly which rules to follow and which procedure to execute, and in this case, she knows exactly what to do.
The first of the new researchers to finish speaks up immediately. About 5,567 to 9,766, she says, which really isn't the same thing as 4 to 9.
Sorry for not being explicit. If I say for people to raise their hand when they're done, that's so I know everyone is done, and meanwhile, everybody gets a chance to try on their own before hearing anybody else's result. At least you didn't say how you did the calculation, so others can perhaps do their own calculations and see if they think yours is correct. Keltham comes over to look at the scratch paper, if any. What calculation seems to have been done?
Squared both sides of 729 100,000ths, 2,048 100,000ths, and 3,456 100,000ths, divided it by 3. Then compared it to 3,125 100,000ths with both sides squared, then canceled out the denominator since it was the same on both sides of the equation, with some approximations for doing faster arithmetic.
Message to her. Don't smile or anything, but correct. Though 2 significant digits would have been fine there. And she was first of the newcomers, so probably everyone is trying to compute needlessly many digits, which, okay, fine. Keltham will wait until everyone's raised their hand, and then go to the whiteboard and show how he'd have approximated it. 0, 1, 3 asterisk, 0.00729, squared, plus 1 on 3, asterisk, 0.02048, squared, plus 1 on 3, asterisk, 0.03456, circumflex 2 versus 0.03125, squared 1. Tilde, 2 squared, plus 3.5 squared, slash 3 versus 3.1 squared 2. Tilde, 4 plus 12.25, 3 versus 9.613, tilde, 5.4 versus 9.6, slash 6, asterisk 10 equal sign and GT, proportional to 9 versus 16, 4. Tilde, 0.00054 versus 0.00096, where step 1 is dropping the first term, that's obviously going to end up insignificant, multiplying both sides of everything by 100 and rounding to 2 significant digits. I mean, we wouldn't do that in civilization, because we have computers to do the calculation for us, and here you might not do it in a science report, but it's definitely fine in my classes. And step 4 is dividing again by 10,000 to put that factor back in, because your experimental report should summarize the absolute likelihood of the data, not just the relative likelihood of the data. Somebody who wants to compare some completely different hypothesis's likelihood, one you didn't even consider, needs the absolute likelihoods to do that. They need the 0.00054 and 0.00096 version, not the 9 versus 16 version. Imagine that we've got 2 separate research groups, both testing the hypothesis that all 10s solve 246 with 50% propensity, or alternatively, less than 50% propensity. They each don't know the other group exists. However, they both use the, hypothetically for this thought experiment, universally standard rule that less than 50% propensity is of course best modeled in practice by 3 equally weighted probability point masses on 0.1, 0.2, and 0.4. The first group reports a likelihood of 0.02 on the less than 50% meta-hypothesis, and a likelihood of 0.031 on the 50% hypothesis. The second group reports the same thing. The way we've set up the hypotheses being reported on, we cannot just multiply the 2 likelihoods together. The task of combining evidence from different, published experimental reports is now a big, complicated deal, requiring us to recheck their original data and redo all their calculations. Alternatively, if they had both reported likelihoods of 0.007, 0.02, 0.035, and 0.031, on the distinct hypotheses of 10%, 20%, 40%, and 50% propensity respectively. We could have just multiplied the likelihoods together from both groups, and our ability to accumulate data from across multiple experiments would be vastly simplified. Of which it is said out of Dath Ilan, to those Dath Ilani children who need to hear it, different effect sizes are different hypotheses. That, Carissa Pilar, is why we can't just have the hypothesis that all 14S have at least 5 times the propensity of all 10S to solve 246 in 30 minutes. We can look at the data and see if that actually happened or not, but as soon as we try to figure out the exact likelihood that it happened, we are cast into a nightmarish multiverse of different ways the world could be, such that the statement, all 14S are more than 5 times as likely to solve in 30 as all 10S is true about worlds like that, all of which have different likelihoods of yielding the data we saw. Like just on this breakdown, that could be because the chances were 0.2 and 1.0, or 0.1 and 0.5, or 0.1 and 0.6, or 0.1 and 0.8. And every one of those hypothetical propensity as two tuples will yield a different likelihood for whatever data we saw. So you'd have to put a prior on their relative odds inside that meta-hypothesis bucket before you could calculate the likelihood for the whole bucket. And then, actually seeing any data would update the odds inside that bucket, which would change the likelihood for any future experiments, even if the replicators saw exactly the same data you did. And that takes us to the principle I wrote earlier on my to-do list. Number 2. Separate experiments are usually supposed to avert conditional dependencies. Watch out for when that isn't true. What I mean here is that, when you are otherwise doing things correctly, it should usually be the case that, for the likelihoods that the published experimental report is summarizing for different hypotheses, if some replicators came along and did their own experiment, their likelihood should be something they can calculate independently of your data. It shouldn't be the case that they have to look at your data to figure out the likelihoods given their hypotheses. This, in fact, is the property that lets us compute the joint likelihood of a hypothesis across 2 experiments by multiplying the likelihoods together from the separate experiments. Symbolically, probability of data from first and second experiments given the hypothesis equals probability of data from first experiment given the hypothesis times probability of data from second experiment given the hypothesis, if and only if. Probability of data from second experiment given the hypothesis equals probability of data from second experiment given the hypothesis and data from first experiment. When you say, maybe all 14s have 60% propensity to solve in time and all 10s have 10% propensity to solve in time, you're describing a way reality can be, where the likelihood of my found pattern of yes and no responses, if that's true, is just the same no matter what data you found in your own experiment. Maybe your data made that world look incredibly improbable, but that doesn't matter. I can still answer the question of how likely my data would be if that world was the case, without looking at your data. When you say, maybe all 14s have at least 5 times the propensity of all 10s to solve 246 in 30 minutes. That is a way the world can be, but it's a way the world can be, where calculating the likelihood of my data in that world requires me to make up a bunch of prior probabilities, and then those probabilities change depending on the data that you got, which makes it immensely complicated to quickly look over the summaries of what different people's experiments said about different worlds and combine them together into a joint summary of what reality has told us about them all. It would, in fact, be possible to combine a lot of little experiments, all of which suggested that, if you wrote the summary this way, the data was more likely if all 10s had 50% propensity to solve versus less than 50% propensity to solve, and get out a new update that the combined data was more likely if all 10s had less than 50% to solve. If you multiplied enough 0.035 likelihoods from the 40% propensity hypothesis compared to the 0.031 likelihoods from the 50% propensity hypothesis, then eventually the 40% propensity hypothesis would come to dominate the predictions of its bucket, and then its bucket would start to dominate the other hypothesis. Which paradoxical-seeming combination, again, doesn't happen if you consider the 40% propensity hypothesis separately, because then it's clear from the start that 40% propensity is gaining on 50% propensity in each experiment. Hence again the proverb, different effect sizes are different hypotheses, which argues again against thinking that all 14s are at least 5 times as likely to solve as all 10s is a good way to split up the world for purposes of science. Even though, in terms of truth-functional scaffolds, it is a way the world can be. It could even be the meta-fact that is useful and that we're interested in. We should still ask the science question first. What are the exact real effect sizes? And then check the useful meta-fact afterwards. Likewise, if you started thinking that this coin isn't random, or this coin is biased to favor queen, was a good way to describe the hypothesis you were considering. If 2 experiments show that the same coin is probably biased to queen by notably different amounts, they're pointing at incompatible ways the world can be. And something is wrong. Some condition has changed between experiments. At least one group is screwing up. You definitely wouldn't say, well, our hypothesis was that this coin was biased to favor queen, and group 1 spun it a bunch of times and found that it came up queen 900 times out of 1,000, and group 2 spun it a bunch of times and it came up queen 520 times out of 1,000, and both of those results are instances of the coin came up queen more often than it came up text. So both confirm the hypothesis that the coin is biased queen, and the experiment has reproduced. You are actually less confident after 2 apparent confirmations of your original statement than you were after 1 confirmation, because in the details of the particular worlds, it's clear that something was wrong with at least 1 experimental setup. But that apparent paradox is just an artifact of bucketing together different ways the world could be, that yield very different likelihoods on the exact data observed, into one meta-hypothesis of this coin is biased to favor queen. If you said instead the coin yields 90% queens, or the coin yields 52% queens, there would be no illusion of the first experimental result agreeing with the second result. There would be no illusion that the result had reproduced. Fix a local hypothesis, a single effect size in this case, that makes the data have independent likelihoods between one experiment and another, that fully specifies the likelihood of the data as a matter of logic, and doesn't change when we read other experimental reports. Summarize the likelihoods for hypotheses like that, and it would be clear that the data from one experiment was compatible with an exact hypothesis, and the data from the other experiment was not. The lesson is, there are these careful, precise details about how to do science correctly, and those details actually matter a lot for making your whole civilization's science output fit together and have the whole thing make any sense. Even for a small project like ours, it's still probably best to do it that way, if we want things to make any sense.
Corva, who was the last to raise her hand for the last exercise and who has been calculating through another panic attack for the past 20 minutes, has now realized that the horrible feeling of wasting lots of time making errors that she still doesn't understand on stupidly complicated problems was the point of all of this. That this incredibly painful classroom experience has all been an illustration specifically for the benefit of Carissa Savar, about why they shouldn't do things the way she suggested. And even though there is no outward indication that the chosen of Asmodeus herself experienced any distress about it at all at any point, Corva thinks that, probably, if she were in charge, she would have experimenters report their data, and then everyone who wanted to see how well that data fit some specific hypothesis could calculate it their own goddamned fucking selves.
There are, even in Dathilan, children who will agreeably acquiesce in doing science, the same way everybody else does it, without carefully detailed demonstrations of exactly what grimdark dooms will befall them if they try to make up their own methodologies that violate the coherence constraints. Tiny Keltham was not one of those children, and besides, even if you report the raw data like a sane person, people do need to know which calculations to do after they've got all the data, right? There are some local calculations that do tessellate together neatly to global calculations, and you might as well summarize those when they exist, which requires you to know how to set up the kind of calculation that modularizes well and distinguish it from calculations that don't.
Willa feels like she's following well, but she did think she was before, and then she still managed to get herself tied up somehow. In front of everyone, as usual. Though in retrospect, she thinks she had it, but there was just a lot of confusion about before Chance's priors and some miscommunication. But overall, she's happy that this particular weird mess of logic is going to stay away from science. The bad buckets were hurting it. She doesn't know science well enough to feel protective of it yet, but she expects she will. Except that expecting yourself to be convinced of something in the future doesn't make any sense, so she might as well feel protective of it already.
Alexandra is apparently quite good at probability theory, since he was following for all of that. He is therefore happy that his knowledge, A, is growing, and B, will probably continue to grow, since he's not permanently behind everyone, and can therefore continue taking the most important class in the world so he can obtain mastery of reality. Alexandra's power and knowledge continue to grow. All hail Lord Asmodeus.
Also, just to be clear, while you wouldn't necessarily get paid very much for it except in very special cases, there is such a thing as just running out and trying a bunch of stuff that you didn't pre-register and aren't going to be especially careful about analyzing if you even report the results at all. That's definitely still science, the individual kind, even if it's not science, the project of all civilization. It is not considered foolish to do non-careful, non-rigorous experiments to figure out which careful, rigorous experiments to do before you spend a lot of effort on writing up something to pre-register. That's, basically what I did the previous day when I was experimenting on boiling acid and having it explode a lot. I wasn't exactly trying to lay a firm foundation for future Galarian science, just poking around rapidly, and trying to get a handle on how chemistry worked with magic in the mix. This, too, is something of a Dathilani stereotype. Stereotypically, it sometimes involves an Ione-like person who tries to prevent the maniacal scientist from accidentally killing himself. They are even, often, a girl and a boy respectively, and it is not unknown for them to end up romantically involved. Though I have to ask again, do I really need one of those when I already have several girlfriends and my new universe comes neatly equipped with healing and resurrection spells?
Yes, because resurrections are expensive, and they are much more expensive when the person has completely dissolved themselves in acid.
Oh. Huh. I wasn't actually aware that it got more expensive if I completely dissolved myself. Good thing to watch out for, then.
Why is her life like this? Even Nethys can't have been this bad. He wouldn't have survived to become a god.
There may possibly have been several romantic interests involved in his continued mortal existence.
I'm actually a little surprised there's not more specialization. If I were imagining how to do this, I'd have some people write detailed experiment specifications based on what they wanted to learn, other people follow the experiment specifications, and then the first people or other specialists do analysis of the results to figure out how to bet.
It's specialized out to the fourth planet colony and back again. There's going to be literally hundreds of people in civilization who do nothing but talk to the big chemistry outfits to figure out exactly what they need and write up exact experimental specs for experiments involving sulfuric acid in particular. Thing is, everybody in that process needs to understand the rules on how the greater science process works and why. You can't write up a good experimental spec unless you know how a replicator will carry it out and what an analyst will do with the data. You can't be a good analyst unless you know what was really going on in the experiment, what the impact buyers were originally asking for, and what the report writers need from you. Good specialists don't have to be good generalists. They can be mediocre generalists, but they do have to be generalists. You don't need to be able to write a pro-level saleable experimental report before you can hire a writer to do that for you. You do need to be able to write a terrible, unreadable report that is nonetheless judged by a professional skill evaluator to contain all of the necessary details. There's literally nobody in the process who doesn't need to understand the law of probability well enough to know the difference between hypotheses that fully imply likelihoods and semantically well-formed propositions that underspecify likelihoods and word sequences that don't even have clear truth functionals yet. Remember, I am not, in fact, by civilization standards, a great experimentalist, a famous analyst, the one who brings the light of cause selection to the world. I'm a teenager, what got tossed into another universe, is what I am. Everything I'm teaching you is what civilization makes sure to teach all of the 8-year-olds, so they'll be able to read the newspapers when they grow up. I mean, not literally, actually. Not every 8-year-old has read a couple of novels in which the protagonist has to improvise scalable production of sulfuric acid, in which, unfortunately, most of the memorable drama was about safety precautions, obviated for us by resist energy, acid. I know more than the bare basics, in a few places, because I thought they seemed cool to know. But definitely everything we've been covering today has been like that. There's a saying out of Dathilan, professional specialization is what grown-ups do when they actually want results. But don't go setting your eyes on a specialist's glory just yet. Let's all get to the 8-year-old generalist level first. If, we can successfully do even that, without me having actually been a professional specialist in teaching 8-year-old law of probability. Keltham's pocket watch shows he's running out of time on his third and final communal share language, baseline, which provides something of a helpful natural time limit on the morning's lecture, so he'll now try to race through some of his remaining whiteboarded pending topics. #3. If every obvious hypothesis has unexpectedly low likelihood over all the combined data, it means the true theory wasn't in your starting set. Often, that different experiments had different hidden conditions. Let's say you're testing only the hypotheses for 20% propensity to solve and 60% propensity to solve. Suppose you test 300 subjects, and 100 of them solve it. At this point, obviously, they're not going to be multiplying things out by hand anymore, and are going to be working with logarithms, log 2, 0.2, equal sign minus 2.3, 2 log 2, 0.4, equal sign minus 1.3, 2 log 2, 0.6, equal sign minus 0.737, log 2, 0.8, equal sign minus 0.3, 2. Bonus points, Keltham declares, for anybody who already noticed that 2 entries in this table are blatantly redundant, but he's writing them out anyways, for ease of reference. 2. S lost. 20% propensity. Minus 2.3. 2 asterisk 100 plus, minus 0.3. 2 asterisk 200, equal sign, minus 296, 2s lost, 60%. Propensity, minus 0.74 asterisk 100 plus, minus 1.3, 3 asterisk 200 equal sign, minus 338. Now, if you are a naive 6-year-old being led astray by an older child trolling you, you might look at this and proclaim that the 20% propensity hypothesis did much better than the 60% propensity hypothesis, by a likelihood factor of over 1 trillion. But really what this data is yelling at you is, the true hypothesis was not in your explicit hypothesis set. Why? Consider about how well the 2 theories say they ought to do, loss of 2 S-wise, in the worlds where they are actually true. Expected 2s, lost given 20% propensity. Minus 2.3, 2 asterisk 60 plus minus 0.3, 2 asterisk 240 tilde, 2 an amp, 1 asterisk 60 plus, 1 asterisk 240 equal sign minus 140 plus minus 80 equal sign minus 220. Expected 2s, lost, given 60% propensity. Minus 0.74, asterisk 180 plus minus 1.32 asterisk 120 tilde 4 asterisk 180 plus 1 an amp 3 asterisk 120 equal sign minus 135 plus minus 160 equal sign minus 295, which is to say that both hypotheses lost way more than they expected to lose. This is a sort of hint that tells you to look for a new hypothesis, like 1-3 propensity, say. It holds even if you get the subtler hint that some hypothesis is doing way better than it expected to do, losing fewer 2s than it said it should lose. There's obviously ways to think about all the possible propensities at once, but Keltham doesn't think he can get to those this morning, given that they don't have calculus yet. There's a similar phenomenon that would suggest 2 experiments were working under different conditions, even if the data got all mixed together before you looked at it. Say you were gathering data to find out the average intelligence in Cheliacs, which you expect to be the sum of lots of tiny factors and hence distributed along a central distribution. Actually, however, your data was gathered for you by a professional data gathering firm, though, you might possibly have not done a lot of due diligence before hiring them. They were cheap, though. This data gathering firm immediately subcontracted out your job to 2 even cheaper subcontractors. What these data gatherers should have found, at least if the data told to Keltham himself was correct, and a couple of other facts seem to have borne it out, was that Galarian has a mean intelligence of 10, with a square root of average squared, deviation from the mean of 2, baseline, deviation of 2. One subcontractor, however, didn't spell-check their survey, and the spelling errors turned off the smarter and more perfectionist people reading it, so their biased sample of respondents had average intelligence 8 and deviation 1. Another subcontractor went where it was very convenient for them to find survey respondents, which was, it turned out, people standing in line to apply to a wizard academy. That subgroup had average intelligence 12 and deviation 1. If both datasets are completely mixed together before you get them, when you compute the average, you'll find it's around intelligence 10, and the deviation will not be exactly 2, but it will be around 2. But the hypothesis. This is a central distribution with average 10 and deviation 2 inches would predict that 10 is the most likely intelligence score you can find. Intelligence 10s will actually be relatively rare. If your distribution is the sum of 2 subdistributions with deviation 1 and averages 8 and 12, 6% or so of subjects will have intelligence 10 instead of 38%, as the hypothesis predicted. You don't need to notice that particular deficiency by looking at intelligence, 10 subjects specifically. It'll show up in the combined likelihood of all the data being much lower than expected, even if the whole thing is calculated by a computer that wasn't programmed to detect that exact kind of anomaly. You can calculate what kind of score you'd expect to get if any of your hypotheses were actually true, and if all the hypotheses score much lower than they expect, they're all, in baseline colloquialism, stupid with respect to the data. This doesn't always happen when different experimenters are working under secretly different conditions and measuring actually different phenomena. It is not always obvious just from the likelihoods, especially if you mix all the data together before checking it. But it is an example of a pattern suggesting that the true hypothesis wasn't anything you were considering. One should always keep in mind, though, that the fair coin hypothesis never looks stupid, no matter how much pattern it's missing out on. If you spin a coin 1,000 times and it comes up queen 1,000 times, the fair coin hypothesis expected to lose 1,000 twos, and that's exactly what it loses. In a case like that, you have to think of the specific better hypothesis. This coin has a 100% propensity to queen, or perform some more general test that implicitly takes into account the possibility of lower entropy hypotheses like that before you can see the problem. If it's just never occurred to you that coins might be biased, if you haven't invented any tests to detect biases, then contemplating the fair coin hypothesis alone is not going to show you that hypothesis doing any more poorly than it promised you it would do. #4. How to specially process the special meta-hypothesis, all other hypotheses. Okay, so according to his pocket watch, Keltham has 2 minutes left to tackle this one before share language runs out, and that is not really a lot of time for what is actually the deepest question they've come across so far. There are always better hypotheses than the hypotheses you're using. Even if you could exactly predict the yes and no outcomes, can you exactly predict timing? Facial expressions? The space of possible hypotheses is infinite. The human brain is bounded and can only consider very few possible hypotheses at a time. Infinity into finity does not go. The thing about all the possible hypotheses you're not considering, though, is that you are not, in fact, considering them. So even if, in some sense, they ought to occupy almost 1.0 of your probability mass, what good does it know to do that? What advice does it give you for selecting actions? And yet there is advice you can derive, if you go sufficiently meta. You could run that test to see if all of your hypotheses are scoring lower than they promised to score, for example. That test is not motivated by any particular hypothesis you already did calculations for. It is motivated by your belief, in full generality, in the set of all hypotheses I'm not considering. All that Keltham can really say, in the 30 seconds remaining according to his watch, is that in the end people don't usually assign an explicit probability there. They steer by the relative odds of those models they actually have of the world. And also put some quantity of effort into searching for better hypotheses, or better languages in which to speak them, proportional to how much everything is currently going horrifyingly wrong and how disastrously confused they are, and how much nothing they try is working. And also you'd maybe adjust some of your probability estimates towards greater entropy, if anybody here knew what entropy was, or adjust in the direction of general pessimism and gloom about achieving preferred outcomes, if you were navigating a difficult problem where being fundamentally ignorant was not actually going to make your life any easier. Well, that's it on the communal share language. Baseline. Time for lunch. Not one of his best lectures ever, but not all of his lectures can be. He did have 3 extra hours left over on that last communal share language, though, and gave those extra hours to Corva Talandria, Willa Shalira, and Alexandra Esquerra, if they happened to want to ask him any questions over lunch that could benefit from their being able to still speak baseline, or if they want to go off and think on their own, or review their notes in a way that uses baseline. They have priority on sitting next to him if they so choose. There is a discipline out of Dath Ilan of learning to optimize reality first and appearances second. Yes, and indeed, appearances cannot be neglected in human interactions, especially commerce. But if you want to look competent, one should first ask, how can I actually become competent? And then, how can I signal that real competence in a way that's hard to fake? Any other pathway is one where you're just getting into an arms race between trying to fake how things look and other people knowing that and not being stupid and guessing what you're faking. At least so it is in Dath Ilan. In Golarion, Keltham gets the impression there are more complicated things going on. Complicated, silly things. It's not going to be like that around him. Yeah, asking your stupid questions can make you look stupid. It doesn't make you actually any more stupid. Asking your stupid questions does, in fact, make you actually more competent. And benefits Keltham, in his teaching, by giving him any idea of what anyone is thinking. Keltham is not particularly under the impression that the people who didn't ask any questions, if he could read their minds, were not keeping many equally stupid questions to themselves. If he could read their minds, he would update in a predictable direction, so he is just going ahead and updating that way now. He is reminding his emotions as well as his thoughts to update that way. Whatever it is that would make silence somehow seem like more a good look in regular Cheliacs, in a way that's a stable equilibrium of incentives, maybe because what you're really showing off is your prudence or your self-discipline. It's not a signal that Keltham knows how to read off from their quiet and their controlledly cheerful expressions. Welcome to civilization. The equilibrium of your incentives here will not be silence.
Okay, there may be a problem here where the most vocal question askers were thus selected to be bad at being a normal Chelish person.
Proposal for next time. We oblige everyone to attend class with shadowy hoods that conceal their faces and distort their voices so they can ask stupid questions in perfect anonymity.
Motion to experiment immediately passes, on grounds of value of information, plus how awesome it would be if we just ended up doing that all the time.
Unfortunately, Alexandra, as he heads off to lunch, now needs to focus more on being Alter Alexandra and less on learning useful things. He would like to know if he can ask Keltham about computer science at lunch, since that is apparently a dark and deadly power that he therefore deeply desires to possess. He thinks Alter Alexandre still wants to possess dark and deadly powers, even if less because they are dark and deadly than because they are powers.
Okay, you know what? Actually, no. Alexandra does not get to ask about computer science. That is going to be keepers only until they know what the hell that is. And by keepers only, Asmodia actually means Asmodia only, with the transcript going to the Most High only unless and until either Asmodia or Aspexia Rugatone says it is fine for other people to know about. Because Alter Cheliax is a very sensible place about these sorts of things, and if it wasn't before, it is now okay.
That kind of sounds like it might change a lot about Alter Cheliax, but it's fine as a specific directive for this project given how much God-bothering it has already attracted.
Acknowledged. Oh no, what's her fancy title? Most of his best options sound like mocking her. Lady Wallkeeper would just sound absurd. Senior researcher, this slave of Asmodeus will obey your commands.
She is starting to be seriously worried that maybe in Galarian, weird people are going to be first and best at mastering law, which has, in hindsight, been something of a noticeable trend on Project Lawful even before this, possibly because failing at law is normal in Galarian, and anybody who doesn't fail, therefore, isn't normal, all of which could potentially lead to things getting very odd around Cheliax.
Corva still has enough of a functioning brain to figure out that being explicitly invited to sit with Keltham for lunch is probably a good sign, and not a bad one, especially since the offer was also extended to Willa, who she's pretty sure is the best at math in the new G group. This does nothing to change the fact that her emotional response to this invitation is the desire to scream and cry like a literal infant, which even a 5-year-old knows much better than to actually do. She wants to go back to her room, bite herself until the desire to cry goes away, figure out how to obtain full transcripts of this lesson, and try working through half the problems again at a pace that doesn't make her feel like she's dying. She also desperately wants to stop having immediate reasons to think in baseline, where all the words are too short and interacting with the normal speed of her thoughts in weird ways. And a bunch of them don't seem to translate into anything except particular technical concepts that she doesn't have enough of a handle on to use. But she doesn't scream because she's not an infant, and she doesn't excuse herself back to her room because she doesn't want to make her weaknesses any more obvious to the rest of her competitors. So she smiles pleasantly, digs her nails into the palms of her hands, goes ahead and eats lunch with Keltham, and hopes that Alexandra and Willa have enough questions to cover for the fact that she's having a horrible day rather than a good one.
Willa's so full of questions about everything that happened during the lecture. Usually she would go hide in a corner and eat her lunch alone, but this was like practically a handwritten invitation. Even Alter Willa would have to be super excited about this, right? Even shy, hesitant, Alter Willa is studious. She couldn't possibly pass up this opportunity. She's really thankful that there isn't a voice in her head overruling her talking to Keltham at lunch. Being Alter Willa doesn't seem like it'll be so bad after all. She'll try to avoid any dangerous topics about Cheliax or related things, but that just means she can talk about science instead. Her head is spinning with all the little details and digressions of lecture that were missed or had to be glossed over for time. But there's one question she has to ask Keltham first. She couldn't possibly resist this one. It's just too tempting. Maybe he even intended them to get insatiably curious. What's computer science? Can you tell us all about it?
Perhaps this would be a good time to dust off Ione's old idea about how one of the most promising new researcher candidates should get a fox's cunning boost and then commit suicide and refuse to be resurrected. They could actually kill Willa, too, and not resurrect her, to make that part more realistic.
Alexander refrains from laughing with horrible, malicious glee, primarily because then he would be tortured for hours, and secondarily because he is too busy staring in awe, and tertiarily because he has the self-control to get on Project Lawful in the first place, and so is maintaining Chelish dignity. This is great, and also, he's going to be tortured for hours.
The Corva, who has the highest knowledge, random nonsense, in the class, has a guess, based on what the words computer science and programming sounded related to when she first heard them. There are words for the idea of controlling constructs or machines without the use of magic, and Corva has run into them in passing in a dusty novel that her library had probably forgotten about. It has not yet occurred to her that some people might not have any non-baseline words for this idea. Machine control stuff, right? She says, idly moving her food around instead of bothering to look up at anyone else in this conversation.
Among other things, yes, but I wouldn't have thought you had enough information to reach that conclusion.
It's just what the word sounded like. I didn't deduce it or anything.
That is interesting. I would not have expected computer science to sound like anything if it was math you didn't otherwise know. Willa, Alexandra, what if anything did computer science sound like to you? Try not to let your answer be influenced by Corva's answer if possible.
Honesty authorized. If this is going to happen anyways, they shouldn't risk Alter Cheliax over the details.
It sounded like something mathy to do with discrete numbers changing back and forth.
It was difficult to comprehend. not easily connecting to anything I understood. Something to do with mathematics would be my best guess. Theirs seems to be some type of connection to programming, which translated as an element of making magic items, shaping conditionals, or if /then/else statements, into magical items. Alexandre has just been ordered to answer, and so does, but right now his top priority is trying to figure out if Alter Alexandre could accomplish actual Alexandre's goal of changing the topic of conversation so that he doesn't get tortured later for failing to salvage the situation, or not. He suspects not. He's been issued strict instructions not to do anything Alter Alexandre wouldn't do, which means he cannot change the topic to metallurgy or chemistry, topics of much more direct interest to Alter Alexandre, because Alter Alexandre wouldn't want to offend Keltham by changing his topic of conversation, he thinks. If his superiors have alternate orders, he is prepared to obey.
Share language might be doing more useful work than I thought, if you're getting connotations like that. Fundamentally, computers are containers of raw causality, raw form, that a programmer, shaper of raw form, can put into correspondence with real things or mathematical objects that you want to gain information about. If you got any validity off the transcripts, it was among the first things I taught here as the underpinning of what law is at all, if you remember how axioms pinned down the forms of numbers and implied the truths of arithmetic. Well, either way. A computer is something where you could start from yeses and nos and connect them up by very simple rules like yes if the inputs are both yes, or yes if exactly one input is yes, and turn that into something which would multiply out 345 asterisk 678 for you, so you didn't have to solve it by hand. Which you'd do by shaping and connecting up systems of yes and no that evolved over time, by rules that mortals specified into a shape that mapped your intents about 345 and asterisk and 678 into patterns of yes and no, and evolved them into a new pattern that represented the answer to that, which I don't have memorized, in the same code and mapping. It's not, to be clear, that computers are directly working with the underlying stuff of reality underneath all molecules and atoms. You could make red and blue marks on paper to represent yes and no and operate the rules yourself for how they evolve over time and exactly duplicate what computers do. Computers just use much tinier marks and do a lot of it very quickly. They can multiply millions of numbers in a second. Computer science is how to do clever things by adding and multiplying and branching millions of numbers in a second. And that is, in fact, how civilization controls most complicated machines, and also how we end up talking to people on the opposite side of the world, without magic. The part where you directly work with the underlying reality fluid beneath all molecules and atoms is quantum computing, though civilization was just getting started on that. Quantum computing would let you do calculations that no ordinary computer could complete before the universe burned out, or get the results of calculations that were only actually performed inside a tiny sub-universe, much less real than the universe that gets to look at the results.
Keltham, a brief word.
Keltham casts message. Is the word possibly going to be shut up?
Yes.
Kay, he can talk about this with Broom later.
Apparently, there's one other sane person on Project Lawful, whom Asmodia had almost forgotten about, which, to be fair, Broom is good at getting people to do.
Willa thinks that maybe she has never wanted anything as much as she wants a computer. Maybe not even a headband. Building all the way up from working with single yeses and nos to lots of big numbers sounds really exciting. And then when you were done, you could actually multiply the big numbers, too, as a bonus. She's about to ask if there's any way they could start making computers, maybe with liberal amounts of magic to help. And then there is a surprise. Broom and Willa starts back ever so slightly in surprise, her mouth snapping shut before she says anything.
Sorry about that. Anyways, computer science is liable to be pretty far out of reach of what Galarian can do for a while, unless magic is a lot better at manipulating very tiny things than I've heard about so far. If magic can manage manipulations on even 1,000 times that scale of tininess, I can probably parlay that into reversible male contraception, for example.
Why is everything this person says made of math? That's a very stupid question, isn't it? Corva is beginning to suspect that when you get to hell, they scoop all of the words out of you and replace them with math. And then every time you talk, you have to translate it out of your native language, which is now math. And that the core reason Keltham is valuable is that no one realized that you could do that to someone without magic. But someone did it to Keltham at some point, and now he's trying to do it to them, which means she should try her best to let him do that. But out of concern for her ability to make it through this conversation, Corva is going to try to redirect him away from math anyway. That would be cool, but no surprise that it's beyond us for now. As far as share language for lectures goes, I kind of expect there are pros and cons. I'm sure I picked up some things I wouldn't have picked up from a lecture in Taldane, but I think it also got me tripped up in places. I'd try to work through the connotations of some word I only had a vague sense of, and I'd end up unfolding it out into some long Taldane phrase before I felt like I maybe had a handle on it, and by the time I was done, I'd have missed a sentence or two and be struggling to jump back in.
Oof. Yeah, it's plausible that literally slowing down and pausing between sentences is the sort of thing I should do in that situation. Hopefully security can get you a copy of the transcript. I should be reading all of mine and checking them, but I do not, in fact, seem to be doing that.
Oh no, there's no way Corva could have seen that coming. But don't nudge Keltham into reviewing all his transcripts is on the wall in purple, and now they need a subject change. A smooth subject change that doesn't make Keltham notice anything strange is going on, or some other person coming by to interrupt, or failing that. Even an outright distraction. Quick, somebody think of something.
Meanwhile, in a totally different continuum, Thelem is having something of an argument with a man of the planet Earth, whose job title translates as scientist.
If you wish to support this AI reading and others like it, please visit patreon.com/AskWhoCastsAI. Any help is appreciated. And thank you to executive producer John Doe 7776059.